December 2nd, 1942, 06:47 a.m., Ottawa, Ontario. The air was brittle with winter cold, the kind that made every exhale bloom like steam from a locomotive. Inside a dimly lit office buried deep within the east block of Parliament Hill, Lieutenant Commander Leonard Murray adjusted his wool scarf and watched the frost crawl along the corners of the window. He wasn't supposed to be there. Not at this hour. Not in this building. The war, he had been told, was something fought overseas. But as he would soon discover, some of its most decisive battles were waged in silence, under fluorescent lamps and between the ticking seconds of a telegraph key. The room smelled of ink, coffee gone cold, and burnt dust from overworked radiators. A low hum filled the space, punctuated by the erratic clicking of typewriters and the static hiss of radio intercepts. 3 young women sat shoulder to shoulder before a wall of receivers, their headphones pressing deep into their curls, their fingers scribbling endless streams of coded gibberish onto carbon sheets. They were the listeners, though no one outside that locked door would ever call them that. To the world, they were clerks, typists, civilians, assisting the Department of Transport. But Murray knew better. They were his ears on the ether, and their pencils were as lethal as any rifle on the front. At precisely 06:49, one of them, a small-framed girl from Manitoba named Edith Gendron, froze mid-stroke. The transmission had shifted tone. The staccato rhythm of the German naval code they'd been following for weeks faltered, then repeated, then slowed. Her pulse quickened. "It's Enigma traffic," she whispered, eyes darting toward the officer. Murray stepped closer, the boards creaking beneath his boots. He didn't need confirmation. He could feel it, that peculiar energy when the enemy slipped up even for a breath. Most Canadians in 1942 had never heard of Enigma. Even many within the Royal Canadian Navy hadn't. The machine, a monstrous typewriter of shifting rotors and endless permutations, was Germany's invisible fortress. The British at Bletchley Park had already begun to pry it open, but their focus was on the Atlantic convoys, on U-boats, and their wolf packs. What crossed Murray's desk, however, came from farther north, transmissions bouncing off Arctic ionospheres, whispered between weather stations hidden along Greenland's frozen coasts. The British had no time for such trivialities, but Canada did, because those transmissions passed over their skies, over their territory, and no one else was listening. The first few weeks had been chaos. Ottawa was not prepared for espionage. There were no underground bunkers, no grand halls of computation humming with machines. There was only manpower, and an urgent request from the Admiralty to make sense of the noise. Murray assembled his team from wherever he could find minds sharp enough to listen between the lines. University mathematicians too young to be drafted, school teachers with a gift for puzzles, linguists who'd grown up translating grandparents' letters from across the Atlantic. By the winter of 1942, they were 23 in number, operating from a repurposed basement under the National Research Council. Every morning, the messages arrived. Reels of intercepted Morse, thin as ribbons, carrying the ghosts of distant storms. The operators fed them into the deciphering machines, crude Canadian copies of the British bombs, built hastily from scavenged parts. They rattled and clanked like farm tractors. The engineers called them Beavers, half in jest. But when one of them managed to spit out a coherent phrase, even a single word that made sense, the entire room would erupt in applause. Those moments were rare, sacred. For most of the time, the Beavers only spoke in fragments, hints, patterns without meaning. Still, it was enough to keep them going. In February 1943, something changed. A weather report transmitted from Station Holsberg, believed to be a small meteorological post on the Greenland coast, carried an anomaly. Its structure was too elegant, its rhythm too precise. Murray had a hunch. He called in one of his newest recruits, a quiet mathematics student from McGill named Henri Dufresne. Henry was only 21, thin as a matchstick with eyes that flickered like he was forever solving equations no one else could see. Murray handed him the transcript and said only, "Find the seam." Henry didn't leave his desk for 16 hours. He traced the message by hand, mapping the frequency of every letter, every pause. Somewhere near the middle, he noticed a quirk, a double spacing after every third transmission group, as if the operator had faltered in rhythm. But it wasn't random. The intervals matched the harmonic pattern of Morse code lengths, long, short, long, like a heartbeat. At dawn, Henri burst into the commander's office with the paper trembling in his hands. "It's not weather data," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's coordinates." Murray scanned the numbers. The locations pointed north, far north, beyond the Arctic Circle. If correct, They marked something extraordinary. A chain of secret German relay stations transmitting atmospheric and naval data directly to the Kriegsmarine. It was the invisible thread connecting U-boats prowling the Atlantic to the Reich's Meteorological Command in Berlin. If those threads could be cut, the wolf packs would go blind. By that afternoon, Ottawa had sent a sealed dispatch to London. Bletchley Park responded 3 days later. Unconfirmed. Proceed with caution. It was a polite dismissal. Murray's Canadians were amateurs in the eyes of the Empire, backwater analysts fumbling with second-hand machines. But Murray didn't care. He'd seen the pattern. He trusted his men, and women, more than he trusted London's arrogance. So they pressed on, night after night, decoding the frozen whispers of the North. They began to recognize individual operators by rhythm alone, the impatient one who tapped too quickly, the methodical one who double-spaced after every call sign. Edith even gave them names. The poet, the farmer, the widow. The enemy became human, and that made the work heavier. Each message they cracked wasn't just data. It was a glimpse into another life, another hand tapping furiously in some icebound hut, unaware that a girl thousands of miles away could feel the tremor of his fear through the wires. Outside, Ottawa sank deeper into winter. Snow piled against the blacked-out windows. The river froze solid. But in the basement, the air remained thick with tension and the metallic scent of ink. Murray sometimes stood apart, listening to the synchronized rhythm of the typewriters. The static, the breathing. To him it sounded like the pulse of the nation, faint, stubborn, and unyielding. Then on the night of March 17, 1943, everything converged. A sudden surge of traffic flooded the receivers. Dozens of coded bursts from the Arctic, all sharing the same prefix. Edith's pencil snapped under pressure. The Beavers groaned under the load, spitting smoke. Murray watched as Henry darted between tables, recalibrating rotors by instinct. Hours passed in a blur of noise and motion until at 02:36 a.m., one of the machines fell silent. A slip of paper curled from its side, ink still warm. Henri tore it free and read aloud. Operation Nordlicht. Activation imminent. The room froze. Nordlicht. Northern Light. The code name had surfaced before in British briefings, tied to rumors of a German attempt to establish a permanent weather base near the Arctic Circle. No one had ever confirmed it. Until now. Murray didn't speak. He simply reached for his coat, knowing what came next. He would have to convince the British Admiralty that a handful of Canadians, working in a damp basement thousands of miles from the front, had just uncovered an operation that could alter the course of the Battle of the Atlantic. Outside, the first light of dawn broke over the frozen river, pale and silent. Inside, the Beavers clicked again, tirelessly, as if unwilling to rest. The war had shifted, not by the roar of guns, but by the quiet persistence of those who listened. March 21st, 1943, 09:12 a.m., London, England. The fog hung low over Whitehall, swallowing the domes and spires in a haze of gray. Inside room 47 of the Admiralty, the atmosphere was colder still, not from the weather but from disbelief. At the end of a long oak table sat Commander Leonard Murray, the Canadian officer whose telegram had crossed the Atlantic 3 days earlier, claiming his small Ottawa team had intercepted and decoded a German Arctic operation that even Bletchley Park had missed. Across from him, a British intelligence officer named Captain Reginald Thorpe peered over a pair of wire-rimmed glasses, expression unreadable. "You're suggesting," Thorpe said, his tone deliberate, "that a group of Canadian clerks and engineers have managed to decipher traffic the entire cryptographic division of His Majesty's government has deemed impenetrable?" Murray didn't flinch. "I'm suggesting we've been listening to a different frequency, Captain, and perhaps," he allowed himself the faintest hint of irony, "a different kind of war." There was a pause, the kind that stretched long enough for the sound of the clock to become oppressive. Finally, Thorpe folded the intercepted sheet in half and tapped it against the table. "We'll verify your findings," he said curtly. "In the meantime, I recommend your Beavers, Gnan, was it? Refrain from drawing further conclusions." The meeting ended as coldly as it began. Outside, Murray lit a cigarette against the wind, his hands shaking not from the cold but from anger. He'd known the reaction before setting foot on British soil, skepticism disguised as superiority. To them, Canada was a supplier of men and munitions, not mines, but he also knew something they didn't. The war was moving north, toward a front invisible on any map. Back in Ottawa, the basement continued to hum. Days blurred into nights. The team working by lamplight under a silence so complete it seemed sacred. The intercepted Arctic transmissions grew denser, their structure more deliberate. Henri Dufresne noticed it first, a repetition of meteorological terms arranged in symmetrical intervals, too perfect to be random. "They're embedding the key in the weather reports," he said, "not in the code groups, in the timing of them." He was right. Every report corresponded not to a pattern of letters but to the delay between messages. By charting those delays against radio frequencies, Henri began to map a lattice of coordinates stretching across the North Atlantic. It formed an arc, from Norway's northern fjords to a cluster of small islands off Greenland's coast. At the apex of that arc sat a single point, marked only by a symbol the Germans used for Aurora. The discovery sent a shiver through the room. Aurora could mean many things, a name, a code name, a location. But to the Canadians it meant one thing, the heart of Operation Nordlicht. The following week, Ottawa dispatched a naval reconnaissance team northward under radio silence. Officially, it was a meteorological assistance mission. Unofficially, it was a search for ghosts. They departed from Halifax aboard a trawler retrofitted for Arctic conditions, the HMCS Brantford, carrying a skeleton crew and 2 wireless operators from Murray's team. Among them was Edith Gendron. She had never been to sea before. When asked why she volunteered, she only said, "Someone has to hear it end." The voyage north was punishing. The North Atlantic in spring was a graveyard of broken ships and frozen air. The sea howled like an animal, salt spray crusting into ice across the railings. Every night Edith sat hunched beside the receiver, headphones pressed tight, logging bursts of static that came and went like phantom voices. The others slept in their bunks fully dressed, the cold biting through every layer. The captain joked they were sailing into the mouth of God's indifference. On the 5th night, as the ship cut through a field of drifting ice, Edith caught something, faint, deliberate, rhythmic. She leaned closer, adjusting the dial. It wasn't the usual clipped German Morse. This was slower, like someone speaking through a broken instrument. The message repeated 3 times, then stopped. She wrote it down, shivering. Aurora active, 24 hours. The captain ordered the engines throttled down. The Brantford crept through the fog like a ghost. At dawn, the lookout spotted something on the horizon, a small, dark structure rising from the white expanse. Through binoculars, it looked like a hut. Smoke coiled lazily from its chimney. Around it, poles protruded from the ice like skeletal trees, antennae. Murray wasn't there to see it, but the radio report reached him 12 hours later, transmitted in coded form. Confirmed. Station operational. Minimal personnel. Awaiting orders. He forwarded it to London. For a full day, no reply came. When it did, the message was short. Observe only, no engagement, maintain silence. But silence was already impossible. On the morning of April 3rd, the Brantford's crew awoke to the sound of engines overhead. 2 Luftwaffe planes, Heinkel reconnaissance bombers, sliced through the clouds, their silhouettes black against the snow. The ship scrambled to conceal itself among ice floes, but the planes didn't attack. They simply circled, observing, then turned east. The crew exhaled in relief. That night, Edith intercepted another burst. Aurora relocation, delayed by ice. Transmission continues. She felt the weight of the words like a chill under her skin. Aurora wasn't a single station. It was a network, moving, multiplying, and for every one they found, another was already transmitting elsewhere. In Ottawa, Murray pored over the incoming data, lines of coordinates converging like veins across the Arctic Circle. "They're building a net," he murmured, "and we're standing in the middle of it." Henry looked up from his calculations. "A net of weather stations?" Murray shook his head. "A net of eyes, the kind that can see convoys before they ever leave port." As April dragged on, exhaustion seeped into every corner of the Canadian team. The Beavers rattled until their bearings wore down. The typists' fingers blistered from constant work. Yet amid the fatigue, a strange sense of purpose bound them together. They had no medals, no uniforms beyond worn sweaters and navy overcoats, but they carried within them a quiet conviction that history itself was listening. Then came the order from London. Cease independent decryption activities. All materials to be transferred to British Command for evaluation. Murray read the telegram 3 times before crumpling it in his hand. "They'll bury it," he said flatly. "They'll take the credit, write us out of the story, and the war will move on as if we never existed." Henri, ever the mathematician, looked at him with calm defiance. "Then we'll send them what they want, but not everything. That night, under dim light and with doors locked, the Canadians copied every intercept onto microfilm reels, sealing them inside tin canisters marked agricultural research. One set was shipped to London. The other was buried, literally, under the snow behind the National Research Council, inside a steel ammunition box. Edith herself pressed the lid shut. "So they can find it," she whispered, "when the world's ready to remember." When Murray returned to Halifax weeks later to meet the Brantford, the ship carried no trophies, no prisoners, not even photographs, only silence, and one small water-stained notebook filled with Edith's handwriting. Inside were the final intercepted codes from Station Aurora. The last entry read, "Signal fading, snow covering antenna, men singing, language unknown." It was the end of the transmission, and in a way of the war for them. The British would later confirm the existence of a German weather base near Greenland, Haudigan Station they called it, discovered by Norwegian commandos in 1945. But nowhere in the official records would the name Aurora appear, nor would the names of the Canadians who first traced its signal through the frozen static of the northern skies. In the decades that followed, their story vanished into footnotes and archival dust. Yet, for those who knew, those who'd heard the hum of the Beavers and the scratching of pencils against paper, the memory endured. They hadn't cracked the enigma in the grand halls of England, nor altered the tides of war with machines of steel and wire. They had simply listened, and in that listening, they'd illuminated the invisible battlefield between silence and sound. And somewhere in the Arctic wind, between the echoes of static and snow, the name Aurora still flickers, the light that never reached the history books. August 1958, Ottawa, Ontario. The war had been over for 13 years, but the building on Sussex Drive still smelled faintly of oil, dust, and old paper. Time had dulled the walls to the color of parchment. The war rooms that once pulsed with the rhythm of telegraph keys and murmured code were now filled with clerks filing agricultural reports, civil budgets, and meteorological summaries. The soundscape had changed. The hum of fluorescent lights replaced the clatter of typewriters, yet beneath that surface hum, something older remained, as though the concrete still remembered the weight of secrecy. Commander Leonard Murray was now a man out of uniform, his hair silvering at the temples. His post-war years had been spent in bureaucratic obscurity, assigned to maritime administration, a demotion disguised as peacetime stability. But on this humid summer morning, he found himself once again descending the narrow stairwell into the sub-basement of the National Research Council, the place where, 15 years earlier, he and his ragtag group of mathematicians and radio operators had listened to the Arctic ghosts of war. A young archivist, barely 30, met him at the door. "We're re-indexing old wartime files, sir," she explained. "Your name came up in a declassification review. There's something you should see." She led him through the corridors lined with steel cabinets, the air thick with the scent of mildew and aged cellulose. They stopped at a locked drawer labeled non-catalogued, Polar Operations. She slid it open and produced a single metal canister, the size of a lunch tin. Murray recognized it instantly. The edges were dented, the paint flaked, but the red wax seal remained intact, the same one Edith Gendron had pressed closed under a lamplight one night in March 1943. His throat tightened. The archivist watched curiously. "We thought it was film, but it isn't. Microfilm, perhaps?" Murray nodded slowly. "Yes, it's a kind of memory." They opened it together. Inside, perfectly preserved, were the tiny spools of film, thin ribbons of history, captured in the cramped handwriting and coded intercepts of a forgotten team. Edith's handwriting was unmistakable, slanted, deliberate, marked by the occasional smudge where her pencil had trembled during those long Arctic nights. He held one frame to the light. Words appeared faintly, a string of coordinates, then a single German word repeated 3 times. Eisfreiheit, ice, freedom. He felt a chill. That was the last phrase decoded before London shut them down. He'd always wondered what it meant. That afternoon, Murray requested access to an old signal analyzer stored at Carleton University, an outdated relic used for training students in cryptology. He spent hours in the dim lab, hunched over the machine, running the film through the reader. The letters flickered across the small green screen, ghostly in the darkness. As he traced the patterns, he began to realize something astonishing. The last transmissions from Aurora hadn't been mere weather reports. They were progress logs, records of scientific experiments. The messages spoke of ionospheric variations, magnetic resonance, and radio wave propagation under auroral activity. It wasn't just a weather station. It was a prototype research facility. The Germans hadn't been trying to forecast the Arctic. They were trying to control it. The implications unfolded like ice cracking on a frozen lake. Aurora had been designed to study how radio frequencies behaved in extreme geomagnetic conditions, data that could be used to improve long-range communication, navigation, even missile guidance. In other words, it wasn't simply about knowing the weather. It was about mastering the invisible. That realization hit Murray harder than any revelation during the war. All those nights decoding, all those transmissions dismissed as routine, they had stumbled upon something far beyond meteorology, and they had been silenced before they could understand it. He contacted Henri Dufresne, now a professor of mathematics in Montreal. Henri's reply came by telegram. If the data exists, it belongs to the world now. Bring it. 3 days later, Murray arrived in Montreal carrying the canister in his coat pocket. Henri met him in a small café on Rue Saint-Denis, his hair now gray but his eyes as sharp as ever. I always knew there was more, Henri said, running his fingers over the cold metal of the canister. They buried us under paperwork, but not the truth. They rented a small projector and unspooled the microfilm onto a screen. The coded texts shimmered like veins of light. Together, they reconstructed fragment by fragment the messages from Station Aurora. Some described experiments involving pulsed transmissions, others mentioned oscillation thresholds, and one contained a chilling phrase, Der Himmel antwortet anders unter dem Licht des Nordens. The sky responds differently under the light of the north. Henri leaned back, his cigarette trembling slightly between his fingers. They were experimenting with the ionosphere, bouncing signals off it, seeing how far they could reach, maybe even beyond the curvature of the earth. Murray stared at the flickering words. They were testing weapons of communication. Henri smiled faintly. No, they were testing the future. It was then that a new layer of meaning began to emerge. The German operators, the poet, the farmer, the widow, hadn't been soldiers in the conventional sense. They were scientists in uniform, trapped by the machinery of war, sending fragments of discovery into the void. And the Canadians, unknowingly, had intercepted not just military orders but the birth cries of a new kind of warfare, one fought through airwaves and frequencies rather than bullets and steel. The next few days were a blur of translation and analysis. They worked from dawn until the city lights reflected off the St. Lawrence, piecing together patterns from the scraps of Morse. The messages hinted at failed experiments, bursts of radiation interference, auroral storms disrupting signals, machines freezing under the polar night. But between the lines, Murray sensed something else, the quiet awe of men who, even in the service of tyranny, were looking toward the mysteries of the natural world. On the fifth night, Henri looked up from his notes. Do you realize what this means? Our work, those days in Ottawa, we weren't just eavesdropping. We were documenting the dawn of the technological century. Murray nodded slowly, and no one ever knew. They decided to publish, carefully, cautiously, under the guise of academic research. In 1961, a paper appeared in the Journal of Polar Radiophysics authored by L.M. and H.D. It described the anomalies of ionospheric reflection patterns detected from unidentified Arctic sources during World War II. The article made no mention of Aurora, the war, or the Codebreakers, but among a small circle of scientists, it ignited quiet fascination. Some would later cite it in early studies of atmospheric scattering and long-distance signal bounce, technologies that would lay the groundwork for the Cold War's communication systems and eventually satellite telemetry. The Canadians' names remained in the shadows, but their fingerprints were everywhere, on research, on history, on the invisible frequencies that now spanned the world. Years passed. The war stories of Codebreakers became legend. Bletchley Park, Alan Turing, the Enigma triumphs. But in the quiet corners of Canada's archives, the Beavers were never mentioned. Their machines rusted away in storage. Their notebooks faded to sepia. Edith Gendron never married. She retired to a small cottage near the Gatineau Hills, where she spent her last years tending to wildflowers. Neighbors said she often sat outside at dusk, radio on her lap, listening to the static as though waiting for something to return through the air. When she passed away in 1972, a wooden box was found among her belongings. Inside were two objects, a pair of cracked headphones and a single sheet of yellowed paper bearing 5 words written in her unmistakable hand. The signal never truly ends. Murray received the news quietly. He was 80 by then, living alone near Halifax. That night, he went down to the shore where the wind still carried the salt of the Atlantic. He thought of the men and women in that cramped basement, of the long nights when the fate of the unseen world hummed through copper wires. He thought of Aurora, the light they'd followed but never reached. Above him, the northern sky shimmered faintly with color, not war's fire, but the earth's own pulse, silent, immense, eternal. He smiled to himself. The enemy had long vanished, but the message remained. That history, at its deepest frequency, is written not by the loudest victories, but by the quiet minds who learned to listen. He turned toward home, his footsteps muffled by the sand, the sea breathing steadily beside him, like static, like memory, like code still whispering from the cold. October 1983, St. John's, Newfoundland. The wind from the Atlantic cut sharp through the harbor, carrying the smell of salt, diesel, and rust. In a small naval museum overlooking the water, a curator prepared an exhibit on Canadian communications during the war. The files arrived from dusty archives in Ottawa, boxes of brittle documents and unmarked canisters. One of them, slightly dented, bore a faded red wax seal. She set it aside, intrigued. Later that evening, as the museum emptied and the gulls screamed outside, she opened it carefully under lamplight. Inside were reels of microfilm, labels faded but legible. Aurora transmissions, 1943-45. She held them to the light. Tiny words shimmered in reverse. Coordinates, frequencies, handwritten notes. Among them, a single phrase repeated across several reels. The sky responds differently. For weeks, she tried to trace the origin, sending inquiries to military historians, veterans groups, even the British archives. Few replies came. Those who did answer knew nothing of Aurora. The name did not exist in official history. Yet one elderly man, a retired professor from Montreal named Henri Dufresne, responded with a brief handwritten letter. It contained only one line: "If you found the light, do not let them turn it off again." The curator never met him. He died a month later. But she kept the film, copied it, and donated one reel to the university's new digital archive. Decades passed. Technology changed and the world's wars became invisible again. Satellites, signals, drones. The frequencies shifted, but the silence between them remained. Somewhere within that silence, those old Arctic coordinates still point north, to a forgotten station buried under ice, to a handful of names typed on fading paper, to a night when a group of ordinary Canadians listened so intently that they changed the shape of a war they would never be thanked for. Today, the name Aurora surfaces only in obscure footnotes or in the whispers of historians chasing ghosts. Yet its legacy endures in the unseen hum of the modern world, in every encrypted message, in every transmission that crosses the sky, in every signal that reaches farther than it should. For the war did not end with silence. It simply transformed, slipping from battlefields into wavelengths, and those who once listened in the cold, hunched over machines that rattled like hearts, remain its first architects, the keepers of the hidden code. As the museum lights dim, the reels rest inside their glass case, light from the street lamp glancing off their surface. The static of the sea murmurs beyond the windows. And if one stands there long enough, one might almost hear it again. The faint pulse beneath the noise, the echo of those who proved that even in war, the smallest signals can carry the weight of a nation.